Hello and welcome to episode 56 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. My name is Sean, here with Sam. Sam, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing well, Sean. We just had a very interesting weekend from a fantasy football perspective, which we've referenced a couple times on this show. How do things sit from where you're looking?
For me, currently I'm on the outside looking into the playoffs, but I am playing Zach, who currently holds the 4th spot in the playoffs, and I am beating him by about 15 points, and he only has his kicker to go tonight. So it's looking like I might win, and if I beat Zach, I leapfrog him into 4th place in our playoffs. So all you got to do is make the playoffs, man, and from there It's anybody's game. And I think I brought this up the last time, or one of the last times we talked about fantasy football. The first year I won the championship, I snuck into the playoffs with a losing record and still ended up winning the championship in the playoffs. So I am the gospel truth. All you have to do is make the playoffs and anything can happen.
Yeah, so the top 3 spots are pretty tied up. I don't think anybody's going to catch Andy or Marty. Haley has a pretty good record, and she's doing okay.
Yeah,
I don't think she'll be.
Andy just beat Marty this week.
I saw that. So I think Haley and Marty now have the same record, or maybe actually Haley will jump him if she wins, but I don't think that's a guaranteed thing. But so I'm currently winning pretty handily, and if I win, then you, me, and Boog will all be 5-5. And I'm not going to say it's a tie. I don't know what the head-to-heads record, like what the tiebreakers are, but we're all sitting at 5-5.
I think it goes you, me, Zach, because you have the tiebreaker on me because you beat me.
Yeah, but I don't think I beat Boog.
Yeah, I don't know how it's all going to play out, but here's my thing and why I'm optimistic about my chances. I've been playing like the last 6 weeks without Justin Jefferson and without James Conner, like my number 1 wide receiver and running back. And I've just been like putting together a hobbled lineup every week.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson and Conner are both off IR now. So I'm feeling pretty positive going into this home stretch here, and just got to make the playoffs.
So this past weekend, or this current football weekend, most of my roster, or most of my starting roster, was on a bye week.
Oh yeah,
actually many of them, including a couple wide receivers, my mainstay defense, and Patrick Mahomes, who is my quarterback, who has kind of underperformed this year. And so I went out and I got Will Levis. And I have Will Levis, Derrick Henry, and then Zach Moss. That's my quarterback and my two running backs. Between the 3 of them, I got fewer than 10 points. However, I still went on to get 143 with everything else, primarily because CeeDee Lamb just exploded, TJ Hawkinson just exploded, and I think Mike Evans and the Dallas special teams defense had a pretty good day. So like that was funny to see, like, oh, very little production and then massive production. I don't know how sustainable that is.
Oh, it's not.
Yeah.
Because like my thing is I keep losing to people every week because they'll have a player go off for like 40 or 50 points. And then all of mine get like somewhere between 15 and 19 points. And that's still just because I don't have one player go off.
Yeah.
I end up losing, but
it'll be interesting.
Fantasy football is not what we're here to talk about.
No, it's not.
Talked last week that this week we were going to kind of put our money where our mouths are. We talked a lot of shit about Rings of Power, and we decided this week we were going to kind of come up with what we would have done in terms of the show. Now, Sam, before we started recording, we said I got a little bit more detailed with what I was going to do. So maybe this is a 2-parter. This episode, we can talk about my run of what I would have done. go season by season. And then we followed up with part 2 and kind of talking about the challenges you came up with in creating your own show. Do you want to give people a sneak preview on what you thought your challenges were?
Well, I mean, to be fair, my challenges were primarily motivated by not having any free time this week.
Fair enough.
And as we said before we were recording, if we were full-time writers and then somebody paid us a lot of money to develop a TV show based on Amazon or based on the second age of Tolkien's Legendarium, we'd probably be able to put a little bit more thought into it. But I think, and let me know how I'm sure you will talk about this, but the primary challenges are the huge time span covered by the second age, the relatively light amount of detail that we get from the approved, the actual sources that you can use. We said we're only going to do the Lord of the Rings and the appendices. Those are the only rights that were available. The Silmarillion and all the other books that have come out, off limits. So that does that in two senses. It limits you, but it also gives you a vast amount of freedom. And I think one of the overarching challenges is to, even in an outline for a show, to respect the themes that Tolkien brings to the work, while also trying to achieve drama. That can be a challenge, even if you're just kind of scoping out how things will flow. And then I mentioned the vast scope of time. In order to get around that, you have a couple of different options. I think we saw in the Rings of Power how they decided to condense a lot of things into the very kind of final period in the second age, where it might as well not even be a second age show. It might as well just be a beginning of the third age, or it's going to end up covering just a handful of years, really.
It would be the end of the second age.
End of the second age. Skipping over a bunch of other stuff. And I think that's something that we'll talk about in this podcast and maybe the next episode as well, is what do you miss out when you skip to the end of an age? What are the things that...
Quite a lot, apparently.
A ton, I think. And I think a ton of really important stuff. And that's one of the things that I struggled with, is how do you do justice to the things that happened at the end of the first age and the beginning of the second age? Because the appendices is not...
They're not detailed.
It's not detailed, but it's also not all second age. There is some reference to first age, and there's some reference to first age stuff in the actual Lord of the Rings book itself. Yeah. So you can, there are some things that you can do, and I think it's important to do that. We'll get into it. I don't know how much you talked about this in your outline, but I've got some thoughts on that. So definitely a challenging task. I'm looking forward to kind of your approach.
Yeah. Should we just jump into it?
Let's do it.
So for me, I broke my show down into 4 seasons. And the general outline is season 1, only elves, Sauron, and Middle-earth. That's it.
Okay.
Season 2, only Numenor. And then the brief interactions between the people of Numenor and the elves. And then that's mostly Numenor and Middle-earth, and like their interactions. Season 3, the first half, I would cover the fall of Numenor. Season 3, second half, establishment of Gondor and Arnor. Season 4, War of the Last Alliance. And then the Siege of Barad-dûr, the fall of Elendil, Gil-galad, and all of that, and Anarion. So now we're going to go season by season. And then you just let me know if you want me to stop, if you want me to elaborate. Okay, yeah, do you have any questions so far?
Well, one, I like how you split it up and looking at kind of the major powers and having that be kind of the overarching focus. One thing that jumped out to me, and this is also how I think about it, how I've been thinking about it, and this is in direct contrast to the way that the Rings of Power show went down, is that you didn't mention dwarves at all.
Exactly.
Yeah. And is there going to be any dwarf popping up, or is it just relatively minor? Okay.
Yeah, no, they will. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
But not a major player like Rings of Power made them.
Yeah, I think that was a misstep ultimately, and there may be things that they do in future seasons that makes that seem less of a mistake.
Mhm.
But I think the real conflict is between the elves, Numenor, and Sauron. And
And if we can add in here, even in the Lord of the Rings, the dwarves don't play a major role. They do in The Hobbit because they are arguably the protagonist, Thorin. And to me, if you want to create, even in the appendices and in the Silmarillion, dwarves are not protagonists. They're always like adjacent stories that are kind of interwoven into the stories of the Noldor and the stories of humans. There's never like this is a story about dwarves.
mm-hmm.
So for me, if you want to include and have dwarves be a large plot point, give me a story all on its own about the wars Dane is fighting during Lord of the Rings, the interactions between whatever Herald of Sauron comes north, and tell me what the dwarves were doing during the events of Lord of the Rings. Because there's a lot there that could be told,
Mm-hmm.
and they have their own war in the north that's going on.
If you want to back up even before the War of the Ring in the Third Age, you have the War of the Dwarves and Orcs,
Mhm.
which happens after the fall of the Lonely Mountain, the Kingdom of Erebor. It's just like, it's massive. And we see a little bit of it in The Hobbit. I was actually, some of the lore stuff that I did like in the Hobbit trilogy from Peter Jackson is that aspect of it all. But even
trying to reclaim Khazad-dûm,
yeah. I mean, there's something there. But yeah, the dwarves are really more of a side piece in a lot of ways.
In almost every Tolkien story.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I was just recently listening to a podcast about Thingol, and obviously the dwarves are a pretty major part of his story.
Yeah, because they kill him.
They kill him. Yeah, I mean, they show up at the end, right? And then it's like they show up, they make the necklace, they try to keep the necklace, they kill him, and then they all get killed. And that's kind of it. And again, going back to where's the real drama of it all, it's not really with the dwarves. Even in what we're talking about in the Second Age, when theoretically the dwarves are involved because they get 7 rings of power from Sauron. They don't turn into ring wraiths. And these rings are never given the same level of esteem that you get with the 3 rings given to the elves. And then ultimately, 4 of them are devoured by dragons, and Sauron gets the other 3 back. And really nothing really ever comes of it.
It just creates the downfall of the dwarves in a very specific way. Like that greed.
Yeah.
And all of that. Yeah.
I mean, again, I doubt that you included this. I know I certainly didn't include it, but like, you could have a show about the dwarves and the dragons in the north and the goblins and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so removed from
it'd be standalone,
the core of
the
story.
Yeah. So I don't really reference dwarves very often in my story that I created. Season 1 of Sean's Second Age series, based on the appendices of Lord of the Rings. The appendices mentions Fëanor, the exile, and then partially the destruction of, I don't know if they ever used the term Beleriand, but the world before Middle-earth. I would open season 1 getting Cate Blanchett to re-narrate an overview of the events of the First Age, and then the fall, like the end of the First Age as well. So that my big chunk of my first episode would be backstory information, and I'm just a Cate Blanchett simp, so I would try my best to get her. And you're paying homage to Peter Jackson's trilogy as well. But I would open with that and then and they kind of do that in Rings of Power as well. They give you a generic overview. But for me, within season 1, I would tell the events. And let me just preface, I think where Rings of Power really goes astray, when you read the appendices and you read the Silmarillion, there is a clear timeline of events. Mordor is a stronghold. The Rings of Power are created before the fall of Numenor. The Numenorians, once they hit a point, seek dominion and lordship over the men of Middle-earth. And that's how Sauron gets involved with Numenor. So in season 1, we only see Sauron as Anatar, Lord of Gifts, interacting with the elves of Middle-earth. We show the distinctions between Celebrimbor, who is willing to work with Anatar. We see the differences between Gil-galad and Elrond, who are hesitant to work with Sauron or Anatar at this point. And then by the end of season 1, we would have the death of Celebrimbor, the creation of the elves or the Elven Rings of Power. We would have my final scene would be the elves putting on their rings and recognizing the power of the One, seeking control over them. But that would be my entire first season. Focus solely on the elves and their interactions with Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, the creation of the Elven Rings of Power, and then the differences between like the Noldor under Gil-galad and those willing to work with Anatar. And you can even throw in some dwarven interactions here because we have Celebrimbor, smithing knowledge, and all of that. So you can show their interactions between like Khazad-dûm and Celebrimbor, but I'm not going to make the dwarves this much of a presence in my story. So that's pretty much my season 1.
So can I jump in?
Please, yeah.
So season 1 would end with the death of Celebrimbor, which do you kind of imagine that is also is that at the very opening of the war between elves and Sauron, or is that kind of part of the way through? How are you where are you placing that in this major conflict between armies?
I would put it more towards the end. So for me, I envision the story going, and again, like I might not be refreshed on when Celebrimbor dies in the timeline, but for me, season 1 would show that initial conflict between the elves and Anatar, maybe the beginnings of the war between the elves and Mordor, because at this point, I'm trying to establish Mordor as a stronghold in Middle-earth, setting up season 2 when the Numenorians finally arrive in Middle-earth. Mordor is established. Most of the men, like the Haradrim, Umbar, they're already under the lordship of Sauron. So I'm trying to establish there's a conflict amongst the powers in Middle-earth at this point. To me, it seemed like a good place when the Elven Rings of Power are finally complete, that they put the rings on and recognize that the One has been created. And then that's when they take the rings off and decide to shield them. That seemed like a cool closing point for me, but I'm open at least for like altering how things happen to make it fit the timeline. And again, that's like my biggest problem with Rings of Power is that they completely ignore like the entire sequence of events and how everything happens chronologically in Tolkien's work.
Well, so a quick departure on that. This is something that we probably talked about it, but I don't know if we gave it enough emphasis in our review of the Rings of Power. The whole idea with the 3 rings and the Master Ring, the ruling ring, is that the 3 rings were created without Sauron's direct involvement, as opposed to the other Rings of Power, and especially the One Ring, which he crafted on his own. The 3 rings were the product of Celebrimbor using the craft that Sauron taught him. And through the use of that craft, Sauron was able to have an influence on the 3 rings. And that's what the elves are able to sense and why they took them off. But in the Rings of Power show, Sauron is seemingly directly involved in the creation. He was there at the time. And so they're going to have to undo all that. Also, the 3 rings were kind of a culmination of the craft after a lot of the lesser rings and the other Rings of Power had been made. So we still need to create all those Rings of Power. And it's, again, we're going back to don't want to spend too much time critiquing the Rings of Power because that's not what this is about. But I think basically they're going to completely elide the war of the elves and Sauron, and it's going to jump right to kind of the conflict between. I don't want to speculate too much, but I think we're going to ignore a lot of the War of the Elves and Sauron stuff specifically. So the death of Celebrimbor will probably be an opening salvo in the War of the Last Alliance and things like that. It's all going to be one big conflict. But what you lose when you do that, and I think this is what your outline so far is able to maintain, is you lose the origin of the conflict between Numenor directly and Sauron. Like, it's generally there as, oh, they're the descendants of the men who fought against Morgoth. But really, the men who fought against Morgoth, they had some small victories, but Morgoth would have won, and in fact did win, until the Valar came in. And so, in a lot of ways, Sauron's actions that create the downfall of Numenor are in part a response for the humiliation that he suffered at the hands of Numenor in the War of the Last Alliance, in the war between the elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age. And he had a long-running plan to kind of wait for the shadow to fall on Numenor, build up his base of support around Middle-earth, and then eventually be involved in the downfall of Numenor. It all just didn't come together overnight, and you miss out on Sauron as this master manipulator. And also an immortal, powerful being who's willing to wait a couple hundred years. Not that we need to see all of that elapse on the show, and I'm interested to see how you'll get to dealing with time jumps. But yeah, I think what your approach establishes that early on, Sauron's involved. We're talking about Anatar, but you're not jumping right to the big, massive conflict.
Yeah, and at least with season 1, because we're focusing solely on elves, I envision time jumps as being like built-in narration, because all of your characters are going to stay the same. Elves are immortal. So we hit these points where we can go, and thus over a couple hundreds of years, this peace lasted or something like that. And then you can delve into the next conflict that you're talking about in the next episode. So season 1, that's pretty easy to get around in terms of time jumps, because you can just kind of build it into the episodes as you go. So that's season 1. Season 2, only Numenor. For season 2, I would get Elrond to narrate, being that he is the distant brother of Elros. We'd get Hugo Weaving to narrate the history of Numenor. Now, for me, this narration would include Elros and Elrond Half-Elven. There's no mention of like Eärendil and like their parenthood, at least in the appendices. So we're going to keep it relatively generic. I would, in this narration, cover almost the entirety of the story up to the fall of the Númenórean kings into not necessarily Morgoth worship, because that happens under Sauron when he arrives in Numenor, but to the turning away of the worship of Eru. And that's all referenced in the appendices. I would end that narration with a highlight of our current king of Numenor, Tar Palantir. Talk about his reforms to trying to bring back the worship of the West throughout this season. So Tar Palantir would be alive. It wouldn't be some hermit locked away in a castle where nobody really knows if he's alive or not. He would be a functioning person. Throughout that second season, we would move into his death and the rise of Miriel. Our Pharazôn would be Tar Palantir's nephew, like he is in the books. I wouldn't create some politician. I would establish our Pharazôn as like-minded of the ancestors before Tar Palantir, that he differed in terms of where he thought the people of Numenor should go, and that he's ambitious. During season 2, I would show Númenóreans traveling to... in that narration, we would show the mariner side of the Númenórean civilization, and that they're reaching out to the peoples of Middle-earth and teaching them like farming and some of the skills that they've developed on Numenor. But then during season 2, Ar-Pharazôn is the one who wants to go to Middle Earth to seek dominion and lordship over the men of Middle Earth. And then during this season, he discovers that becoming the lord of the men of Middle Earth means he needs to best Sauron, who is currently overseeing most of those peoples. And then the season finale for season 2 ends with Sauron willingly surrendering to Ar-Pharazôn. And then they board their ships back to Numenor. And that's where season 2 leaves off.
All right, before we get into the specifics, I have one kind of question for you.
Yeah.
And this might just be my incomplete understanding of kind of Tolkien's intent, but is it your understanding that Sauron kind of baited Pharazôn to come and capture him, and it was his plan all along to be captured, or was it truly he was trying to?
Oh no, he wanted to be captured.
Okay, he was never his intent to actually to fight. It was only his response to the overwhelming power that resulted in his surrender. It was truly that was the plan, was to get him to come here, and then I will surrender.
I don't know if the intent of the story was I'm going to get them to come here so I can surrender. I think it's showing the cunning of Sauron, that when the might of Numenor arrives on his doorstep, he just shifts his plan. And he goes, oh, they are arrogant. They can be easily manipulated. Mm-hmm. And then he just changes to be like, I'll surrender. And then I'll just destroy you from within. So I don't know if it's been like this plan that Sauron is like, oh, I'm going to get the Numenorians to come here. Because he has no say in what happens to Tar Palantir. He has no say that when Palantir dies, Ar-Pharazôn is going to claim the throne from his cousin, Miriel. Like, those are all things that maybe our Tolkien would describe as like Morgoth's seeds that he planted long ago that are finally coming to fruition. But I don't know if it's Sauron's will. It might be like just the evil that was planted by Morgoth long ago finally coming to fruition. And then when Sauron has the opportunity and he sees what's going on with Numenor and Middle Earth, he realizes, oh, if I surrender, I can go to Numenor and then just manipulate them into their own downfall.
Do you
at least think... that's my assessment of that situation.
Yeah, I the thing is, we don't have, unlike the Lord of the Rings, and this was something we talked about in our coverage of the Rings of Power show. Unlike the Lord of the Rings, there isn't a set story that you have to adapt. Right? We're talking about like a handful of lore entries that cover centuries of time. And we don't get a lot of detail about the nature of the characters that are involved, the arcs of the characters that are involved, or the specific motivations. We just kind of hear what happens. We hear generally, the shadow falls on Numenor. Like that's a wonderfully crafted statement, but what does it really mean? The shadow fall, is that something like, is that specifically like the influence of Sauron, like having a physical or a psychic manifestation in the universe? Is that kind of, as you're saying, the inevitable consequence of the tunes that Morgoth introduced at the very beginning of time, the creation of Arda? Like, it's open to interpretation. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. My specific question on this was, do you think there's room for men of Numenor who are specific like agents of Sauron, or who have fallen a little bit further and maybe faster than of Pharazôn and will eventually fall? Somebody who could bring to Pharazôn messages or tidings from Sauron or about Sauron that are intended to bring him to Middle Earth. Maybe some black Numenorians from the colonies south. I
don't even know if I would consider them black Numenorians, but I know the Silmarillion establishes that there are Numenorian settlements in Middle Earth. I think that's something you could borrow. The appendices don't say that, but
I think the appendices reference
They
some of
could.
those havens.
Read it, but I don't remember everything off the top of my head. But I don't know if they need to be black Numenorians, but they could also just be like Tar Palantir is the first king after like, and this is me just guesstimating because I haven't read the lineage of all the different kings in quite a while. But in like 15 kings who have been like turning away from worship of the West.
Mhm.
And then you get Tar Palantir, who's like, we really need to change what we're doing. So it wouldn't be insane for me to believe that the general population of Numenor is beginning to be way more like-minded with Ar-Pharazôn than with Tar Palantir. Like to me, it's like Tar Palantir, Miriel, and then the followers, like the faithful of Elendil and Isildur and Anarion, who we haven't even met Anarion in Rings of Power, right?
Yeah, and I doubt that they're going to introduce him because it would be confusing because he wasn't in the Peter Jackson films, and it would just be another son of Elendil that we have to account for.
Yeah, I guess.
Was
I
he?
guess you're right. Yeah, yeah.
Was he referenced though? Now I don't recall specifically if they
No,
mentioned
not in Rings of Power.
yeah, because we have the sister.
Yeah.
Oh, and will you grant me a small aside to discuss something about the Rings of Power that it actually ties into one of our earlier conversations, one of our recent podcasts with the Ring of Barahir?
Yeah, you want to do that now?
Yeah, just real quick, because and then I have a couple other questions about your approach to season 2. Okay, so in our podcast talking about, I think it was the Return of the King or the Two Towers Extended Edition, we talked about the Ring of Barahir, and I think we discussed how it was, if not the oldest, then one of the oldest items in existence on Middle Earth because it was crafted probably even in the years of the trees on Valinor, and it was a gift from Finrod, Galadriel's brother, to the human Barahir, who then like gave it to, or it was inherited by Beren, and Beren used it to kind of call on the services of Finrod during his quest for the Silmaril, and eventually it became an heirloom of the line of Beren, which culminated, or not culminated, but included Elros, and it became an heirloom of the House of Elros, and eventually it passed not to his descendants that maintained the kingship of Numenor and the queenship, but to the faithful, and that's how it ended up eventually with Aragorn, is because it went to people including Elendil. Now, in the Rings of Power, we have many interactions between Elendil and Galadriel, and never once do they mention the Ring of Barahir or its connection to Finrod, her brother, which seems like something that would have been relevant to their conversations, to the point where when she was threatening him with a knife, you think he would say, do you not know like what this ring signifies? The enduring friendship between the house of Finrod and whatever. There would have been a great potential for a character moment there, and it just in the show itself, if you're looking for cool stuff to do. But then you have to imagine if those two characters actually interacted with one another, the Ring of Barahir would have been a point of conversation because she wouldn't have seen that ring for thousands of years, but she would know it. Anyway, that's my aside about the Ring of Barahir.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just way too much detail. Like,
but it's
no, I'm saying it would have been great. It would have been a great detail, but that's not the level of love that they put into the show.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that's my only response to that. What are your questions about season 2?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the kind of transition between season 1 and season 2. So season 1 is the season 1 would have included the entirety of the war of the elves and Sauron, including the death of Celebrimbor and the destruction of Eregion.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have included the forces of Numenor showing up at the end of that war to kind of save the day?
Not yet. I would have included that in the narration.
Okay.
Of season 2. Because at this point, I'm still talking about the former glory of Numenor and the worship of the West and the dealings with the elves.
Mm-hmm.
And again, for listeners, this is all like a work in progress too.
I think this is one of those areas where, in my thinking, that's kind of a dramatic moment that you would want to portray, is Numenor showing up to save the day, because it establishes the origin. It shows the origin of Numenor, not the origin, but it shows the height of the good possible through Numenor, where they're gonna show up and throw down and frankly defeat Sauron, who's at that point wearing the One Ring, right? He's conquered a ton of Middle Earth. He's destroyed Eregion. He's got the elves. He caused Elrond to retreat away. He's got kind of Gil-galad on the ropes, and then Numenor shows up. I think that could be cool. And I don't know if it.
So yeah, you could include that in the end of season 1, and then the narration of season 2 could include that in one of the points of talking about the storied past. Yeah, and then for me, season 2 would basically pick up with Tar Palantir, because I don't want to cover so much history in season 2 about the Numenorians, because I don't want to just burn through actors portraying different characters, and then you would lose the interest of the fan. But if you can find a way to give me the information in a general sense about the history of Numenor, and then just pick up right in the same time frame of the beginning of the fall of Numenor, to me, that's the perfect point to come in. And I'm not, like I said, I'm sticking to the general themes that Tolkien created. Ar-Pharazôn is the nephew who is the son of individuals that were not of the faithful. Miriel was in line with her father. Ar-Pharazôn seizes the scepter when he forces Miriel to marry him. Like, all of those things, I don't know why the showrunners of Rings of Power decided to change all of that. And it just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a certain amount of timeline compression that is inevitable looking at what we have. And I think they were guaranteed 5 seasons, whatever it was. And they're, I guess, looking ahead to see more dramatic stuff, but you have to spend the time to establish the locations, the characters, the people, the kingdom, so that we actually care when, but skipping all the way ahead, there's a downfall, if you want that to land dramatically at all, but also that we cheer for them when they're successful, that we care when they make a mistake or when they do something heroic. And by rushing all that, it's too superficial. But at the other time, you can't spend. I think the real problem with the Second Age is the Numenor stuff, because they come into contact over thousands of years with the elves, and the humans, the human actors have to change. The human characters have to change. You can't, but the elves can all stay the same. And in that case, yeah, the continuity for the viewer is possible. So the Numenor problem, I think, is a hard one. And I think the right approach is, as you did, where you're going to do a time jump, and then either through narration or maybe some other device, you can establish the history up to that point and then set the stage right at the beginning of when things become dramatic. And so I like the inclusion of Tar Palantir. And I think that focusing an entire season on Numenor, as opposed to spending time jumping over to Middle Earth, spending time with the dwarves, spending time in Mordor with, these, elven and human and orcish characters that we are meeting for the first time. That was one of the things that worked against the Rings of Power, but I don't think there was enough meat on the bone of their Numenor plot to make it interesting enough. But I think here you actually would, if you go back to Tar Palantir.
Any more questions, or are we ready for season 3?
Hit me with season 3.
So this is much less notes here from me, but the first half of season 3, and it doesn't have to be one half. I guess it would be with how I've set it up. So the first half of season 3, fall of Numenor. We end season 2 with Sauron surrendering and boarding a ship to Numenor. In season 3, we see the slow manipulation of Sauron on Ar-Pharazôn. We see the tree not being tended. We see human sacrifice beginning, and we see open worship of Morgoth happening in Numenor. And then we're going to juxtapose that with the faithful's interaction. We have Elendil, Isildur, Anarion. We have Isildur stealing one of the fruits of the tree, and then the inevitable fall of Numenor, with Ar-Pharazôn mustering his navy and sailing west towards Valinor, and then the inevitable collapse into the abyss. We see Sauron as Anatar, Lord of Gifts, fall on his throne into the abyss, and then we see his spirit fly out of the abyss, and he can no longer shapeshift into something good. We see Elendil, Isildur, and the faithful sailing away from Numenor, surviving the massive waves that encompass or envelop the island of Numenor. And then we have the second half of the season is the sons of Elendil and Elendil establishing Gondor and Arnor, the relationship building between Gil-galad and Elendil, and the development of Minas Tirith, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil. And then that leads us straight in, and I'll just keep going. It leads us straight into season 4, which is War of Last Alliance. We have all of the conflict between Sauron, the elves, the Numenorians. We have the 7-year siege of Barad-dûr, the battle at the Dagorlad, like all of that in season 4. And then we just put a nice neat bow on it. We could even have like an outro narration leading into the events of Lord of the Rings. We could see again in that narration the fall of Isildur, but that's basically my show. It's a 4-season series. First 2 seasons are going to be pretty much one elven, one men. Seasons 3 and 4 would be a mix of everything. And season 3, I split it up, one half Fall of Numenor, one half Establishment of Gondor. But you can include storylines happening in Middle Earth amongst the elves in season 3 as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even with what's going on in season 2, like I could see some stories amongst the elves that would make sense to include during the events of the second season. So it doesn't have to be entirely men, like we have with season 1 with Numenor showing up to save the day. There could be interactions happening with Gil-galad and Elrond and all of that, but I don't know. And in this, like season 1, when you have Gil-galad and Elrond knowing that this Anatar, Lord of Gifts, is something mischievous, juxtapose that with Gil-galad in Rings of Power, who's just a buffoon. So you can establish that these intelligent, wise characters are intelligent and wise, and you don't have to go about it in a very shitty way like Rings of Power does.
So a couple of things jumped out to me. One was I haven't gotten as far as you have in kind of laying out the arcs of the various seasons, but something I was kind of although thinking, kind of planning backwards from where do you end it? And I was kind of torn between, do you end with the Isildur taking the One Ring and you just kind of leave it to your audience to fill in the gaps based on their knowledge of the Lord of the Rings movies or the books, and you know what happens to Isildur in the ring eventually? Or do you show that? And if you end it with the death of Isildur, is that too much of a downer to end your show? Because theoretically, up to that point, like again, if we're going to be, I thought the Peter Jackson, we've talked about this a little bit before, but the Peter Jackson movies make Isildur out to be a very flawed character and almost evil in the way that he takes the ring
portrayed,
but in reality, like I think we talked about it before, he was taking the ring to Elrond, to Rivendell, because he knew he couldn't handle it, but he didn't know what to do. He knew he didn't have the will to master it, and it would cause his downfall. And so he was taking it to the wisest person that he knew. And of course, he was attacked by orcs and he was betrayed and all that other stuff. So I'm thinking your adaptation, my version would have Isildur be more of this heroic character, a little bit more self-knowledge, even if he's not as wise as the wisest. But then having the show end with his death would be very hard. How are you thinking about exactly where to end it? What's the kind of tone that people walk away with?
I would include his death.
Okay.
So for me, the cutting the ring from the hand of Sauron would be the second to last episode.
Mm-hmm.
My final episode would include Isildur bringing the ring back to Rivendell, his fall, and that of his children at Gladden Fields.
It's going to be a heavy episode.
It is.
But you almost have to do it.
But then your silver lining can be his son that he leaves in Rivendell. You can have the interaction between our Elrond actor and Isildur's son, and then have that Elrond, or we can go back to Hugo Weaving, narrate, show me the height of Gondor and the kings and the splendor. We don't have to cover the downfall of Gondor into the stewards, but give me a narration that shows me how peaceful this time was, the belief that Sauron is dead. We can mourn the loss of Isildur, but you can show me all of this in narration at the end and leave me on a positive note. And then you're kind of opening it up when you get to the events of Lord of the Rings. You can rewatch the trilogy and go, okay, that's where we were. And that's one thing. I don't think Peter Jackson's movies do a really good job of showing me what the height of Gondor was.
Yeah.
Like the first time you see Gondor, it's the stewards. And then you get Isildur and you get Gandalf talking about what it was like here, but you never get to see it. And
I think that's why I think your season 3 didn't have a ton of detail, and that's fine because to a certain extent it's about where you start and where you end, not everything that comes in between. That's what the actual the writing process would be, right? We're not getting that much detail.
Millions of dollars. I'll
exactly.
Give you a full written season 3.
Yeah, but the establishment of Arnor and Gondor, it's like, yeah, demonstrate to everybody the height that Gondorian or that Numenorian civilization had reached, right? The incredible architecture that goes into the Minas Ithil and Minas Anor and Osgiliath, and the use of of all 7 of the Palantiri, right? And the creation of Isengard and the impressive the arts that at the time of the Lord of the Rings are lost to humans. They're lost to the heirs of Gondor. Can I back up real quick? I want to talk about the ending of the show and the death of Isildur, because I had an idea as you were talking, and I also thought that you need to show the death of Isildur, but you also need to show his living son in Rivendell and the delivery of the shards of Narsil, because that was something. I think it was a squire or something like that escaped the disaster of Gladden Fields and arrives in Rivendell.
He's the only one that survives.
The sole survivor from the battle, and then his son is in Rivendell. And I think you can have a scene with Elrond where he's kind of talking to the son of Isildur, contemplating the shards of Narsil, and you get a little bit of that. Can Elrond see the future, or is he just a lore master? He can kind of, I would say, give a little bit of dialogue about, not everything is clear to me, but there will talking about kind of what the future will hold, and it'll be some evil, some good, but ultimately the line of Isildur will prevail or something like that. And then you can have a fade in from Elrond giving that speech at that point at the very beginning of the Third Age to him looking out over the council of Elrond, and you can see Aragorn there. So you kind of you do a massive time jump, but you don't change actor, you don't change location. All you do is advance 3,000 years to his own and then you can tie into hopefully what is the knowledge of your audience that, oh, he's right. The sword is reforged. The line of kings endured, and Aragorn will end up reestablishing and reuniting the kingdom. I think you could do it like that. Pay us Hey,
But that's my show. That's my 4-season show.
okay.
Next week we can talk about yours.
Yeah, and
If
I,
you have any different ideas.
I have a few different ideas. I'm not going to get into those details. Some of those details I already kind of know how I would form it. Some of those things are yet to be formed. I want to give you all due respect for going first, to the extent that I guess your take on it is going to influence mine. I will acknowledge that there were some areas where I know that we are different.
See, that's why I wanted to go first, though, because then I can claim all credit.
Use all the good stuff. Oh, you're so much like Sauron. Okay, a couple of things. Just thinking about specific stuff that happened in the Second Age. Did you contemplate trying to incorporate the like creation of the Nazgul and the giving of the rings to the 9 kings of men?
Oh yeah, that's
Okay.
all season 2 or season 1 with the elves. So like for me, it's like I didn't cap number of episodes. I
Mhm.
left that pretty open ended, and I hate when shows are like, we're going to have this many seasons with this many episodes per season. Like if season 1 takes 20 episodes, give me 20 episodes in season 1. And if season 2 takes 14, give me 14 episodes. Don't fill them out like a certain amount of time because you're contracted to fill a certain amount of time.
Mhm.
That, like, to me, that's where big shows fuck up. It's like you cut too much stuff or you expand too much stuff to where the show gets boring. And if I was writing this, I'd be like, each season, this is what we want to cover. Let's write it. However many episodes it is, that's how many episodes it is. But that's my take on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the ideal way to approach it, right? You have to acknowledge that on the business side of things, people are going to want to know, like, okay, the difference between 10 episodes and 20 episodes could be hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah,
right?
but this is you.
This
you
is,
said
I mean,
this is me. This is what I
oh
would
no,
do
I
for
know,
a show.
no, I acknowledge that. I do think I think this is something with the Rings of Power, for instance, I talked about it a little bit. We covered it a little bit in our review, but when they knew that they had 5 seasons from the very beginning, I don't think they were under nearly enough pressure to craft a story that would justify itself, right? And so that you get some of this timeline compression, you get the introduction of stuff that has nothing to do with the actual drama going on at time. For instance, we didn't mention hobbits at all, right? Then it just shows you how not connected to the drama of this timeline the hobbits and the stores, the Harfoots, whatever you want to call them, are.
They're not connected until fucking Smeagol finds the ring.
Absolutely. They're not even around at this point in the Legendarium. Okay, so that we got on that point by talking about the creation of the Nazgul. Did you think about any of the stuff that is kind of alluded to, like, for instance, the Isildur taking the oath of the Men of the Mountain?
Oh, because that's in Lord of the Rings. See, I was primarily focused on the appendices, but yeah, I mean, totally throw that into either season. Well, that'd probably be season 4 when we're doing like the full-fledged War of the Last Alliance.
Yeah,
like as they're mustering armies to charge towards the Black Gate. Yeah, you could totally have the oath of the Men of the Mountain.
Yeah, I thought that'd be cool. You'd have the opportunity to, because they're ghosts, right? You could basically just adapt them. Get the screenshots of the Return of the King and just turn those into the actual costume, the actual look of the people that you're portraying, and then you could show the the stone of. It's not Karok. It's
but the one behind Minas Tirith.
Yeah, like in the one that's like in the mountains, the black stone. They're like kind of interesting how it got there. Yeah, some of those I thought that would just be a cool thing to include. Not one, it's book accurate, but it also would be a little remember berry for certain people, like for fan it's a little fan servicey, but it would be a cool thing. And I think anytime you actually have available to you stuff from the body of the Lord of the Rings, you want to try to fit in there because it's a little bit more fleshed out in the
I mean, shit,
appendices.
we could reread Lord of the Rings and just make a list of all of the different references that we would love to see that take place in the Second Age that you could include. Like, there's a shit ton.
I think the Council of Elrond. I mean, we most recently watched the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, and the Council of Elrond is really kind of trimmed down. That chapter in the actual book is chock full. Like, Elrond gives a history of everything, basically. I mean, he's just huge overview. And I think that's where you can get a lot of the things for, especially the Forging of the Rings, the War of the Elves and Sauron. There's, again, detail in the appendices, but it's right there in the book. And
I mean, you could have your own series just on the fall of Arnor and like the wars of the Witch King.
Oh yeah,
and like show me a Numenos, like the seat of Elendil in Arnor. Like, those ruins are still there in the events of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
so
you could have
I don't know.
You could have a show Amansul before it was a ruin, right? When it hosted a Palantir. Okay, I'm just trying to think of any other things here. One of the kind of grisly details that we've talked about in our Rings of Power thing, kind of contemplating whether or not they're going to show it, is the human sacrifice and like, what does Melkor, what does Morgoth worship look like? Did you think about any of the like specifics there? Because that could be some pretty cool drama of like some faithful characters that we really care about getting slaughtered. Yeah.
I said in my recap, human sacrifice of season 2. So I would anticipate seeing that. And they even say that it's the faithful. And trying to remember in the Silmarillion, do they say that Isildur's fate, had he been caught, would have been sacrificed to Morgoth? I think they reference something like that when he goes to steal the fruit from the tree.
Yeah, I that sounds correct. I know he was injured in that whole
he was like almost mortally injured.
Yeah, like he was in a coma or something like that for a long time, and then finally kind of woke up just in time for them to escape. But that would be a really cool scene. I think that's some of the stuff where you're kind of,
and that's we have references to Morgoth in Lord of the Rings, so it's not like we can't reference members of the Valar, individual members. I don't know if the Lord of the Rings ever mentions Manwë or anything like that, but you get a direct reference to Morgoth.
You do. I mean, and is it talking about the Balrog or talking
about... It's a Balrog of Morgoth.
Yeah.
So in particular, you could, to me, totally reference Melkor, Morgoth, whatever in your series.
I think one challenge is that the name Anatar is not included in the Lord of the Rings or in the appendices. So
is it not in the appendices?
Yeah. So I was listening to, I think it was some Tolkien content creator on YouTube. They were talking about how Anatar is not included in the rights that Amazon got and or that are available. The Tolkien estate has not sold the rights that would include the name of Anatar, and that's why, for instance, in I think it's the Lord of the Rings online, his name is different. The character is the same. It's Sauron in disguise, but his name is different.
Sorry, I pulled up on my book and I'm looking to see. He resolved to challenge Sauron the Great for the supremacy in Middle-earth. And at length he himself set sail with a great navy. Okay. Yeah, they only use the term Sauron.
So that would be something that would need to be worked around. But I'm sure you could come up with something that sounded similar, got the same point across. Mm-hmm. I guess that does open up a point about how are you thinking about the like cover story that Sauron as Anatar would give, and what is it about Celebrimbor versus Gil-galad, Elrond, Galadriel, where he seemingly couldn't detect the evil nature or was less sensitive to it? How are you thinking about that?
I'm cool with what they're doing kind of in the series, where he's so focused on his smithing knowledge that, to me, Sauron would play into that and say, talk him up a little bit. Oh, your craft, your skills, or this is where we could reference the dwarves, better than what the dwarves could do. Greatest among Noldor. And then he could call himself like a lord from the east and just be like, I have knowledge I can give you, and you could be one of the greatest who have ever lived. You could challenge the skills of Feanor and all of this, and then just really kind of talk him up. At least that's how I would do it. But
Okay.
all he has to say is, if he appears as an elf, whatever it is, he could appear as a man, but just say he's from the east. You don't have to go into too much detail. There's a number of references in Tolkien of people who live in the east. We have the two blue wizards who went east, and then we never hear anything from them. So there's a whole bunch of references that we don't really know what's out there.
Yeah. In that similar vein, I guess to put a pointed question on it, you would not have Sauron as Anatar, or whatever name you want to give him. You would not have that character present himself as an ambassador of the Valar.
No, because it's not referenced in the appendices that way.
Okay.
I'm trying to operate within our parameters.
How much reference to the Valar would you see? How would you handle that?
See, that's why I got really particular with season 1, saying the worship of the West.
Okay.
I never mentioned the Valar. I spoke in general terms of beings to the West that the Númenóreans worshipped.
I think that depending on how you want it, like what type of effect you wanted, you could approach that. You could really lean into that, right? Like I could imagine, depending on what you actually have the rights to, and this is where I've gone over the appendices recently. I want to double that down as I prepare for my explanation of my approach. But you could have, like, you could show, even you didn't even have to name them, but in the narration, in the kind of prologue flashback, however you would approach it, you could show the Valar, like during the end of the War of Wrath or something like that, right? And then you could kind of reference, and you wouldn't have to name them necessarily, but you could reference back, and like you could really lean into that, especially with Númenor demonstrating the practices of the faithful, right? Mm-hmm. And then compare that. So your season 3 part 1 could really be like a clash of faiths, literally, between the faithful and the Kingsmen, with kind of demonstrating Valar worship versus Morgoth worship. And then I guess talked about a little bit, if you wanted to get allegorical, which Tolkien did not like doing, did not like allegory, it would lend itself to that with, you could comment on all sorts of things. And I think that's something that I mentioned before, where there's tons of stuff that you could comment on. Tolerance, faith, colonialism, empire, all sorts of stuff, greed. There's tons of rooms for commentary, but you could also just turn these things into kind of the drama of actual human life and human history, but portrayed through a fantasy medium.
And that's the bow on Sean's 4-season series on Second Age Middle Earth.
If you like what you heard, share, comment on Facebook, come to our community page on Facebook, discuss your thoughts, your reactions, your questions for Sean and his version of a Second Age show set in Tolkien's Legendarium, or utilizing those materials. Let us know what you would do differently, what you like, any additional criticism you have of the Amazon Rings of Power show. We're always happy to hear it. And then tune in next week for my version, when I steal all the good parts from Sean's and call them my own.
Bye, everybody.